Good morning, Blythe. I think I figured it out. I was definitely wrong, but I think I figured it out now. This totally explains it. It's in. I was going in totally the wrong direction, but I figured it out now. I'm just going to explain it here because I think I actually have an explanation that makes sense. Okay, so I think I figured it out. Okay, hear me out. So, yeah, no, that made no sense. But I figured it out. Okay, I've got it. I had literally forgotten about that song. I think I have a recording of virtually every song that I've written in some capacity at least. Um, thank goodness, because I've been writing some of them down lately, and they definitely help when I've forgotten bits. But I love what you've done with it. The octave jump was absolutely scrumptious, and you nailed the rhythm. So that was awesome. It's now gone from like a few chordy bits to an actual song. Um, I'm not sure I can claim terribly much credit because I'm pretty sure after the first bit, uh, we were like co-authors or co-composers or coco-umpters. Yes. As for my compositions, I'm flattered. What I've heard of you, what wait words, what I've the things I've heard you play are beautiful as well, and watching you flick the levers as you go must be some kind of like wizardry because that's just amazing to to be able to do while you're playing. Um, Turns out I don't have a great explanation for how the song works theory wise. I actually brought it to office hours with one of my professors. It was great and kind of like looked through the chords uh, and sort of came to the same conclusions I had already come to, which I'll explain in a second. But it turns out there's something called a chord sequence rather than a chord progression, where it doesn't follow a strict key, um, or in this case, even a strict time signature, and it kind of just goes from chord to chord and meanders like a constant. Um, Whoopsies. So it's kind of constantly modulating without having a strict key that it's going back to. Here's a chart of a bunch of the common time signatures, and I think this is something that threw us off, which is that it's none of those. Um, and I think that made us assume that we were the ones who were wrong and that we could fit it into one of these more common ones. But we couldn't without changing the rhythm. And if I remember, we actually did do that, where it initially looked something like this. This is just the first three chord sections. And the last two notes were both the same value, versus in the one that you were playing, which is what we had gone to. Um, it has same three bars up here. It has just the last note as a quarter note or shorter. And so back to the original, we had counted it up to be something like 13/8, which feels strange. And so we had changed it, which goes to 14/8. And we had, in our simplified ways, gone down to 7/4, which I guess simplifying the fraction made it feel better, even though that's kind of inaccurate. It definitely should be 14/8 because the eighth note is what we're counting, since it does kind of groups of three and then a group of two. We could break it up so that it was mixed meter, so that it would break up into like 9/8 and then 5/8, and kind of make each of these measures into two measures. That might be easier to see, or something like that, or like 6/8 and then 8 8 wait what the, anyway. But if we're to stick with this, which is what my professor kind of agreed with, then that's it. Kind of goes by chord as well. It is a lot of notes to count up, so maybe that's a flawed rendition. So that's for the more simple beginning rhythms. And then on the back, it changes. I'm not sure. I think this is something you added and it was really pretty. The kind of neighbor tones and passing tones, which act as ornamentation. And the way that you did them, which I personally like, has extra beats in those measure sections before it changes to a different chord. So with this one, you add 2 extra eighth notes as I've written it, and with the second one, it's the same thing. So we'd probably change type and signature for just those 2 bars. And if it was to be like 16/8, that's a lot to count up to. Like, you don't really want to count up to 16 every bar. So what my professor suggested is that we kind of break the pattern and break it up. Like we do we do a 12, a bar of 12, and then like a bar of 2, 2/4 or something, because this little section is different and might be easier to see if it wasn't globbed onto this big mess. So basically it doesn't, just like the chords, which we'll get to in a minute, it doesn't follow very conventional timing and then shifts, even though it keeps the same pulse throughout. So that's interesting, because then it goes back to the 14/8 as I've written it. And I didn't write it all out, but so we could play it either way. Just playing the right hand for a minute, the 13/8 original version would sound versus the one that we had settled on, which is 14/8, would sound like. And I think, if I remember, one of the reasons we shifted other than just the meter is it sounded repetitive in the left hand when we did 2 quarter notes in a row. These eighth notes kind of stood out as sounding like the same thing. Like, yeah, so they stood out by sounding like. And that kind of sounds more percussive than. Which has more of a shifting kind of movement to it, I think, at least. As for the chords, which I actually find a bit more interesting, I'd initially written in G minor because that seemed to make sense, with the first chord being G minor and then having that picker D third at the end. However, it didn't quite add up. If we go through it in G minor for a sec, no, it's written in C minor here. It would be minor 1 chord, major 5 chord, but then the problem is this F minor chord, because you'd have to have a flatted scale degree 2 and then be suddenly in natural minor with the F natural. And that's unusual, and it's just unusual to have a 7 chord. So that led me to think it was in C minor, because then you'd start on a 5 chord, and I guess be in natural minor because it's a minor 5. Then go to major 2 chord, which isn't diatonic, but anyway, and then go to a minor 4 chord, which made a bit more sense, and then a 1 chord. And the other thing about the major 2 chord, I was thinking that didn't quite make sense either, but if you have a 5/5 chord, it's the 5 chord of the D major that you just played. So it's kind of like going, you're in C minor, but you're playing the 5 chord, and then you're playing the 5 chord of that, and then like going. So I guess that made more sense, but my professor was thinking that it might just be a chord series instead of a chord progression and not have a strict key. So that would sort of explain why it doesn't, it's kind of like constantly shifting. It doesn't really come back to a home base. And then with the A major, that doesn't even make sense in C minor particularly either. It's like a major 6 chord, but with scale degree 1 raised. So that's all a bit of a mystery. I don't have a great explanation for it, but it's definitely interesting. I think all the chords just relate to each other enough that it's a little unusual. Like you're a little surprised when it goes there, but if you listen to it enough, it sounds normal. It sounds like expected. Like if I just play the chords. Like it kind of just noodles around in there. So I think that's the best explanation I've got for now. Another thought I had was that maybe it was going down rather chromatically, like not quite, but sort of with the. But that didn't really add anything. So then I was wondering if it was some kind of like there's all the different patterns where like you can go around the circle of fifths, I was wondering if it was something like that with G and then D, F, C, kind of a downward, upward, downward thing. There, I don't know if that's anything. Anyhow, so my professor seemed to really like it. Said it was pretty, even though I just played her the very low beginning bit that I had written down there. Something she suggested, depending on if we wanted to kind of keep going with it, depending, we could just have it be a short and sweet little thing. If we wanted to keep going, because it's kind of a fun little doodly thing. Something that a lot of composers like doing, classical, like Bartok or whatever, is kind of switch the parts. So the left hand would be the long notes and the right hand would be the rhythm, which doesn't quite work here because it would sound very percussive, which I'll show you in a sec. But so we could kind of make that more of a kind of counterpart to melody thing going on instead of accompaniment being all hammery, but something like anyway, something like that. That's a bit funky. Just to add some kind of contrast and interest to bring attention to the parts without just repeating them a whole bunch. But I don't know if we want to do anything with it. I'm guessing it would be rather difficult to play on the harp given all the weird noodling. But maybe I'm wrong there. You've played some pretty crazy stuff. The ornamentation portion, what I was saying about the rhythm, adding those, I was figuring that would be the best way to write it because you kind of took time on it, which sounded nice. So if I just play that part, like it goes together and then if I just play it. That was a bit wonky, but the ending of both of those measures matched up with the eighth notes in the left hand more or less. just because it looks weird when I write it this way because it changes meter, um, and doesn't really feel like it. But I think that's the best way to write it and continue the repeat, like the measure breaking per different uh, kind of chord. This is already getting quite long, so I'm just going to play, if I can remember, a short little waltz that I found when I was looking back to see if I had any recordings of this, and it was what I played right before playing this, the one we've been talking about. Um, Hello again. My phone conveniently died, so here is take two. Let's see if I can still do it this way. More or less. Well, I think that's going to have to be it for this video because it's getting quite long. But I have much to say about the other points in your video. Like Doctor Who, I cannot believe you weren't enlightened before this point. I feel like that's a failing in my part. So I'll get to that in its time. So, we'll see you next time. Love you, miss you, and see you soon.